Hi, I'm Joetta Maue. I'm a fine artist that primarily works in hand embroidery. And so I'm talking today about how I'm inspired by working from the everyday experience. And I started working this way mostly through text because I'm not a skilled embroiderer. I'm actually a photographer by trade, and I was not intimidated by the text, but I started to work by doing autobiographical statements that sort of express the psychological experience of every day and trying to exist within relationships and also just your own self-identity. And so I do a lot of text-based work, but it's mostly sort of about the inner dialogue that we have with ourselves. And while I was doing this text-based work, this is a replica of a love letter, I was also simultaneously doing a photographic series of still lifes of the domestic space and what I would eventually start to call narrative portraits, because they're really not about the individual, but about the moment that that individual might be in. And what I was really interested in looking at was how our life is made up of the mundane, everyday moments. It's not really made up of the big moments. It's made up of waking up in bed with someone or without someone, and just sort of that daily experience of the in and out and wax and wane of the emotional experience. And so eventually those photographs led to larger scale embroidered portraits. Again, not so much portraits, but narratives that are using the figure. And I continued to work this way and sort of evolved my process. As I said, I'm not trained. I'm completely self-taught as an embroidery artist. And so eventually I started to work much larger scale, which this is an example of. This also has a lot of text on the left-hand side that's white on white, so you can't really see it in the image. It started to become more three-dimensional. And this image-based work is really about celebrating the small moments of intimacy that we have. And what ended up naturally happening was that these places happened in the bed, because that's where we tend to have our most intimate experiences. And so eventually this work evolved into a series specifically of sleeping figures. And this worked really perfectly for me as a metaphor, because the bed is a really interesting place. We all sleep in one, probably. Most of us are born there, most of us die there, most of us have our most significant intimate moments, but also the worst moments of our life in bed. And so it really worked for me as a metaphor for that sort of ebb and flow of the daily experience. And it's also this sort of overlooked place. It's the door that we shut when people are in our house, or the last room we renovate, but we spend something like a third of our life in bed. And so I started to do this series, and I'm just really interested in investigating and celebrating the fact that these are the places that we really live life, and looking at the domestic space as a place to contemplate and to see the beauty in. And what I noticed with this work was it was very much about the togetherness of intimacy, but that's not the whole story. Part of intimacy is the moments where we feel alone, or the moments we feel space. And so this led to a show that I did in Brooklyn called The Space Between, which this is the sort of anchor piece of. And it was much more about the moments where you don't feel that intimacy and that connection. And I really enjoyed that process, and that eventually led to the work that I'm now working on, which is, I moved away from the figure after about 5 years of working with it to look at the objects that are the everyday experience and kind of represent. I'm a mother now, so a lot of it's about being overwhelmed by the objects of the everyday experience. So I started with doing a series of piles. I'm sure we're all familiar with those, which can be really overwhelming, but also really beautiful and an example of life happening. I have a small child, so another huge part of my life is a multitude of toys. So I've done a large series, these are all still very in process series, of the sort of way I discover toys in my space, which my son is very meticulous about his toy arrangements, so they lend themselves to being made into art. And now I'm actually working on houseplants, which I don't know if that slide made it in, but this is also like the objects. And I started to look at houseplants as an everyday sort of signal to ourselves, because when our houseplants all need watered, it means our life is probably a little out of balance. So now I'm working mostly with imagery of houseplants and looking at the beauty of them dying and coming